Hi, welcome to Nativity in White, a new YouTube channel by my good friend Chris XS. My name is Eric. I go by the moniker Boss Butcher on a couple of podcasts, kind of movie-related podcasts, one called Terror Troop, the other called Found Footage Files. Be happy to have you as a listener, but I'm here to report out on an album that I love. Even though it's not my favorite album by this artist, I think it's an interesting album and a kind of an overlooked album a lot of times by a lot of people, but I am talking about 1982's Creatures of the Night. There it is on my iPad. I have it on iTunes nowadays, even though I'm an old fart. I have gone the iTunes route. I did have this album on vinyl years and years ago, and as a kid I listened to the hell out of this album. Kind of a comeback album in a way for Kiss, but I'm going to give you a little background of the period in time when this album came out, and why it's been kind of overlooked in my opinion. Not necessarily by Kiss fans or even hard rock fans necessarily, but younger generations, even when you get into Kiss, your heavy hitters are Destroyer and Rock and Roll Over, some of their bigger albums, Kiss Alive, things like this, and then through the 80s later on, as they dropped the makeup and the band changed the lineup, it gets lost in the shuffle sometimes, and I think it's kind of an important album. Last album with Kiss wearing their makeup, at least temporarily. They did bring it back later on. A lot of eventful things happened around this album. But yes, it was 1982, and to give you a little slice of what it was like when this album came out, here's some of the top charting album or songs from 1982. I'm looking at the Hot 100 1982 archive, and they go all through the year, but here's a few of them. Physical by Olivia Newton-John. You had Daryl Hall and John Oates, I Can't Go For That. You had Centerfold by the J. Giles Band. Finally, you get some hard rock a little bit. I Love Rock and Roll by Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. The Chariots of Fire title by Vangelis was pretty popular. Ebony and Ivory by Paul McCartney and Stevie Wonder. You had a lot of other artists, Survivor, The Human League, Steve Miller Band, Chicago, on down the line. The thing you'll notice is the only hard rock I even mentioned there was Joan Jett, who has her career just blasted off with I Love Rock and Roll. Kiss put this album out, and it was kind of a dead period for hard rock and heavy metal in the United States, and even the definition of heavy metal has changed so much over the years. When I was a kid, heavy metal included some bands that truly are still considered heavy metal, like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, and in a way that's what kick-started, well, in a big way, kick-started the heavy metal resurgence in the 80s, and in fact it was the top dog in the 80s pretty much as far as commercial success as a genre of, or a subgenre of music. But those British bands invaded the U.S. in the early 80s, even before this album came out, but it wasn't just overblown until a little bit later in the decade, of course. But I grew up, there was very little to choose from as far as hard rock or heavy metal went. I was born in 1968, so I grew up listening to a lot of great rock and roll music. My parents were younger than a lot of the parents were back then. A lot of them were World War II era parents and Korean War. My parents were much younger than them. So I grew up listening to Led Zeppelin, ZZ Top, you name it. And as a kid, in the mid-70s, Kiss was huge. They blew up. Every kid I knew liked Kiss virtually. Kiss, Destroyer, and Rock and Roll Over, ones that really stand out to me, and Love Gun. We loved them, and I was a pretty little kid, but they were amazing. They even had a TV movie that was made about them. You can look all that stuff up. They had a comic book. They were just a sensation. And the serious rock and roll critic types, the older crowd looked at them as a novelty, didn't respect them. That's just kind of the way they were looked at back then. But they were forging a influence that has stayed for years and years and years. Now, I don't want to get too dragged down into the history of rock and roll or whatever, but here we are in 1982. You're listening to things like Men at Work, as far as hard rock goes, there really wasn't much. Yes, you had the British bands I mentioned before, but mainly, you had AC/DC, you had Ozzy Osbourne, Black Sabbath. They had split up, of course, and Ted Nugent. Ignore his politics, please, but amazing musician, great hard rock artist. But Kiss was there, and Kiss had kind of lost their way a little bit. At least me and a lot of my friends felt that way at the time. They had released Unmasked, which they weren't really unmasked on, of course. And, they had the music from The Elder, which came out right before this one. They'd kind of softened their edges a little bit, and I don't know, they hadn't taken it to that next level. But this album was a return to the hard rock and Kiss that we all loved. In fact, arguably rocking harder than ever. Peter Criss, the drummer, had departed the band in 1980, and Ace Frehley was actually on his way out of the band when this album was recorded. He didn't actually record any of the guitar tracks on this album. That was largely Vinnie Vincent's work. There were other session musicians that played, but Vinnie Vincent laid down like 6 of the tracks, I believe, on the lead guitar. And a great guitar player, by the way. I don't know where he ended up. I've heard a lot of crazy stories about that guy over the years, so I don't know where he is now. But anyways, on the cover art, of course, you see Ace Frehley there, and the new drummer, Eric Carr, who had been there. He took over a little before this album was made, of course. But he was wearing the fox makeup. They kind of retired the cat makeup that Peter Criss had worn. And he brought that bombastic, huge drum beat that was so prevalent in the 80s. And I think it really is an influential album. Sure, they were borrowing from a lot of the hard rock bands. They were a smart band. They took good ideas and ran with them, and they were very creative on their own and pounded out some really good songs. Now, this album is 9 tracks. Pretty heavy on Gene, I guess. A little heavy. 5 of the tracks are Gene Simmons tracks, and 4 of them are Paul Stanley. And this is kind of also the first album where those two pretty much took over the band, and at least that's fan perception. I mean, it may have happened years before this, of course, and I certainly don't claim to be a Kiss expert. There are plenty of people out there that could tell you every single detail of this album, but I just wanted to share some of my enthusiasm for it. And why this album kind of leapt to mind for me, I revisited it. Ace Frehley recently released a album called Origins Volume 1, where he covered Rock and Roll Hell, which originally was a Bachman-Turner Overdrive song, also known as BTO. I am not really up on that band, but they were a bigger band in the 70s. Some of your younger kids might want to check out some of the things they did, but they're a big band in the 1970s, and they played on into the 80s. They may still be around for all I know. I don't know. But Rock and Roll Hell, great track. I love the way Ace covered it on his album, but you can't beat Gene Simmons belting out those lyrics. Great tune. And there's just a lot of good songs. Overall, a very, very good, solid Kiss album. Go through some of the tracks right now that I like. The best one for me from Paul Stanley on this one was called Danger. I really get a kick out of that song. Has some cool vocalizations matching the guitar work and things like that. I enjoy that, and Paul's voice, of course, amazing. Creatures of the Night's a pretty good song, kind of a prototype of a lot of the music that was to come later for Kiss and other bands down the road. Keep Me Coming, good solid tune, kind of a Zeppelin-esque type song. And then you had Danger, which I mentioned. And then the ballad, which a lot of people look back on the 80s with the hair metal and all that stuff, which is, I struggle with that term, because to me it means something different to the younger crowd. But there's a ballad on this called I Still Love You with Paul Stanley. If there's a voice that's made to sing hard rock ballads, it would be Paul Stanley. Definitely one of the greatest frontmen out there. But I'm more on Gene's side on this album. His solid, every song. Saint and Sinner, incredible song. Rock and Roll Hell, which I mentioned before, probably my favorite song on the album. Then you got I Love It Loud, which there was a music video shown on MTV to this, where there's a kid sitting down in front of his TV and he's like hypnotized and turning into a Kiss soldier as he watches the video. And I remember you could see it on MTV back in the day, but they shied away from hard rock. It just wasn't as huge as it got to be later on. But they did show this video, and I remember it, and I've seen it, several billion times over my lifetime. Then you had Killer, awesome tune. That was another one of the singles that was released. And another one of my favorites off of this, of course, is War Machine, which is just an ass-kicking Gene Simmons song. I love Gene's work overall. They always have that kind of a boogie to them, that bop along kind of just good sound, and then the aggressive vocals and his chip on your shoulder kind of lyrics. Gene was definitely a master of getting a hold of us kids and our teen angst back in the day, and he's still just a fantastic business person. Don't always agree with what has happened with Kiss, but you know what? I don't live behind the scenes. You don't know what happens really between these guys and why Gene and Paul have such a stranglehold on the power structure of Kiss, and why Ace and Peter are out, and all that stuff I won't get bogged down into. By the way, a huge Ace Frehley fan. He's probably my favorite of all the Kiss musicians. I started out liking Paul Stanley as a young kid. Probably his songs were more melodic and things like this, and the imagery and stuff, he was really cool. But I love Gene too, of course. Can't help but like Gene Simmons as the demon up on stage. But there's some other interesting factoids on this album. Regarding the guitar work, I did want to mention one of the guitarists, because I love the song Rock and Roll Hell, and the guitarist that played that song was Robin Ford, and he played with the Allman Brothers band, I believe, or one of the Allmans he played along with in Chick Corea. He's done a lot of really blues and jazz type guitar work in his career, but he did play the lead guitar on that song, which was amazing. You never know. I mean, unless you're some kind of a expert on music, which I don't claim to be, it just sounded like Kiss. This album sounded like Kiss, only bigger and brasher and louder. But there you go. There's that little mention I wanted to give you. The other thing I wanted to mention was a funny story I was reading. Was I dug into the history of this album, and I don't know that I ever was aware of this as a kid, but there was a time where Eddie Van Halen was being considered to be the replacement guitarist for Ace Frehley, and both parties decided against it. From what I read, Gene Simmons being the businessman, they wanted somebody kind of unknown that could preserve the mystique and all that kind of thing. And then Eddie Van Halen, I mean, I know they were having issues at that point even in Van Halen, but I don't see how it would have made sense for him to join Kiss. There is some shared history there, of course, because Gene Simmons discovered Van Halen. But anyway, I thought that was interesting that Eddie Van Halen was considered for the job. Now, Rolling Stone magazine gave this album 1 star out of 5. Just typical of what you would read in Rolling Stone. I used to hate Rolling Stone. Well, I've never been a huge fan, let's put it that way. But I used to hate them because they would never give any respect to hard rock music ever until, hard rock forced them to give them respect, which came later on in the decade. But, years later is when this album really got its due. It never even went gold until 1994. It finally went gold, and that's just, Kiss's albums were platinum, multi-platinum sellers for years and years until they kind of had that dip during the disco days and the pop music of the early 80s. They kind of got lost in the shuffle, but did get its gold status, and it's worthy of that. Guitar World and Kerrang! Magazine both rated it in the top 5 hard rock albums of 1982. It deserves to be there. There wasn't a lot to choose from, granted, back then, but it was a solid album, and I believe it really had some definitive 80s characteristics as far as the 80s hard rock sound went, with that big drum beat and the structure of the songs, the way they went, and the thematic elements of the songs. Just trying to think of anything else I can mention to you. Peak chart position for this album back in 1982 was number 45 on the album charts. In Europe, it ranked much higher, in the 20s in many cases, and I just want to say European hard rock fans are just so awesome. It never really dies over there. It seems, from my perspective, someone living in the United States, there's always this footage from these huge European rock festivals, still bringing huge crowds. It's exciting to see. But I guess that about wraps it up for me on this. I wish I could share the music with you, but I don't want to, step on any copyright laws, and I don't know what direction Chris XS wants to go with his channel here on Nativity in White. But I've been honored to come in here and share some of my feelings about Kiss's album, Creatures of the Night. There again, not my favorite Kiss album, but it's definitely one of the top 5, maybe, Kiss albums that I really enjoy. And I think it's one that just gets overlooked, and it's worth a look for you younger listeners that are into the hard rock music, and maybe even just discovering Kiss. It could be possible. But anyway, my name is Eric, also known as Boss Butcher, reporting out here on Nativity in White. Go out and check out Creatures of the Night. Fantastic album.